Okay, in this video we're going to talk about what's meant by common access resources. So common access resources are the fourth type of market failure you need to be aware of. And you'll notice that a lot of these common access resources have similarities to both public goods and goods with positive externalities. Sorry, not goods with positive externalities, goods with negative externalities. So common access resources, what we mean by common access resources, they come about because of a lack of property rights. So what I mean by that is most goods are bought and sold in markets where buyers are both exchanging something of value. These goods are generally private goods, and what happens is generally somebody has property rights over them, which basically means that they're the person that owns that good. So it might be that they own a laptop, or they own a book, or they own property, and that allows them to have the right to sell it to somebody else. So if they sell it to you, there's a transfer of ownership, and now you own that good. So property rights are basically the formal and informal rules regarding the use, ownership, and transfer of property. So when we use the term property, in this case, we're talking about any sort of possessions. So most countries have property rights, which basically means that consumers are able to own certain goods and services. So it's those property rights that allow transactions to take place because somebody owns the thing initially, then they transfer that to the other person for ownership. Common access resources are resources that are not owned by anyone. So nobody has property rights over these resources. They normally don't have a market price and are therefore available if you've not paid to use them. So the key thing with common access resources is that, like public goods, they are non-excludable. Nobody has property rights over them, so everyone can get access to them without paying for them. So anyone can utilise these resources without having to pay for them in a free market. But the reason they're not exactly the same as public goods is they are rivalrous. And when you refer to them as rivalrous, it's basically another word for saying that if people keep consuming them, they will run out. They are limited, and therefore if people keep consuming them, it's going to affect the other people's ability to enjoy that same product. So common access resources, they're not owned by anyone, they don't generally have a market price, they are non-excludable, but they are rivalrous in consumption. So some examples of common access resources. The fish in the ocean. So when people go fishing, obviously if you eat a fish and catch a fish, nobody else can catch the same fish, clearly rival in consumption. So the fishing industry removes more fish from the ocean than the rate of reproduction, which is basically a fancy way of saying that we're taking more fish out than fish are breeding, and therefore that can affect the marine ecosystem and fishing stocks start to get depleted, which could happen to the point where there's a point of no return and we run out of fish. So fish is an example of common access resources. Clean air, I know we've referred to clean air as a public good, but if you think about it, nowadays, with humans intoxicating the atmosphere and dumping pollutants, one person's consumption is affecting other people's consumption because they're reducing the quality of air for others. So clean air is clearly non-excludable. You can't stop somebody from breathing, and you can't make them pay. But because it's now rivalrous in consumption, some people's consumption are affecting others, it is an example of a common access resource, more so now than a public good. And forests are another example. Forests are often available for use in a lot of countries by the public, and they can be used for agricultural purposes, so to grow products, or they can be used to cut down trees for timber. And the problem with this is that in the long term that land can be destroyed. Everyone has the incentive to use the land for their own self-interest, and that can lead to overgrazing, it can lead to a lack of biodiversity, and therefore the forests aren't available to grow food on in the future. So forest, clean air, fish in the ocean are all examples of common access resources because they're all non-excludable, but they're rivalrous in consumption. The market failure that occurs with common access resources is basically all the environmental problems which can impact future generations' living standards. So essentially everyone's acting in their own self-interest and therefore has an incentive to use as many of these common access resources as possible because it helps to, they can consume them, or in some cases they can sell them. But basically that can come as the trade-off because a lot of these common access resources, and you'll hear me refer to them as CAR, C-A-R, common access resource, it basically highlights the trade-off that exists between pursuing economic goals today, so that we might be pursuing growth through cutting down trees, but it can lead to environmental problems in the future. So by attempting to boost allocative efficiency in the short term, by turning them into tables and chairs, so forests, so that people can increase their living standards, or giving people access to more food by fishing, that can help in the short term, but it can lead to intertemporal efficiency in the long term. A reduction in intertemporal efficiency in the long term. So the market failure is the overuse of common access resources today, reduces the amount available for future generations, which can harm their living standards. And the reason they're over-consumed is because basically there's no incentive for people not to maximise their consumption today. because if they don't consume, somebody else will. So an example would be new technology allowing for us to fish more, to extract more fish per hour. That can lead to a fall in the price of fish because there's more supply, and it gives people greater purchasing power. So it has that idea of boosting allocative efficiency in the short term because fish are cheaper, more affordable, boosts our purchasing power, but it can hurt our living standards in the future. You'll also hear the word referred to as tragedy of the commons, which basically means that with common access resources, everybody acting in their own self-interest will aim to maximise their utility, and therefore they will, cut down trees, or they'll over-consume fish or catch fish, and that can lead to the destruction of common access resources. So the key things are the lack of excludability, because they're non-excludable, and the absence of prices. You don't have to pay for a lot of these things, can lead to excessive production and consumption that use up all our common access resources, so we don't have them for the future. Thank you.